we'll move on. A couple of things I wanted to tie in as far as tying up loose ends from the last lecture. Spartan women. Spartan women were more independent than other Greek women, owing to the fact that their husbands spent a lot of time in the barracks. In fact, the husbands were expected to live in the barracks till they were 30 years old. And also the husbands were away a lot. So, well, away from not only away from their home, but away from the city. So Spartan women then developed a certain degree of independence. And the other thing I wanted to tie in was about Solon. Solon, in effect, told the Greeks, we're in economic hard times here, but instead of expecting me to pull you out of it, I want you people to pull yourself out of it, which was really the wisest thing he could have done. And this led to decades of prosperity for Athens, because the Athenian people just got together, well, the government's not going to bail us out, lets us pull ourselves out. And modern day politicians could really take a lesson from that. In other words, is it up to government to bail us out of economic hard times, or is it up to each of us to individually get to work and bail ourselves out of hard times? Solon told the people, I'm not going to bail you out. And that wound up leading to decades of prosperity. All right, now we got through with the Battle of Marathon and talked about how the Olympics runners still today run a 26-mile run from, they run a 26-mile run from start to finish, which is called the marathon. Anyway, King Darius died. His son took over the Persian throne, a son named Xerxes. It looks like it should be spelled with Z's instead of X's. Xerxes sent a bigger army than his father had sent, and he was more determined than ever to conquer the Greeks. So he decided, the Greeks decided to fight on two fronts, one front on the land and one on the sea. The Persians landed first before the Greeks were ready, and initially they hit the city of Athens first and won. The Persians did, that is, and they sacked Athens. Then the Persians marched on toward one of the Greek mountains. Actually, they were heading for Sparta. King Leonidas of Sparta had 300 men, and they fought shoulder to shoulder in a pass that might have resembled something like this. In other words, here's a tall hill. The pass is called Thermopylae. Battle of Thermopylae. Now, there's been a movie made of it, about the 300. I don't know if any of you happened to see it, because the movie came out about 15 or 20 years ago. But there was a movie made of these 300 men, and according to the story, it's told that the Spartan king Leonidas was told that they can shoot so many arrows that they'll actually blot out the light from the sun. And King Leonidas said, well, good, we'll fight them in the shade. Anyway, these 300 men stood in this pass, shoulder to shoulder, abreast to abreast, and they withstood the Persians for a time. But there was a traitor among the Greeks who knew a way to get around the pass, and he showed the Persians a way around the pass. And the big weakness of the Greek way of fighting was if you get around behind them, you could whip them. Because the Greek armies were so disciplined, they would not turn around. Their backs also were unprotected. They wore all their protection on the front. Their armor, such as it was all in the front. Their backs were bare. And the result was these 300 men were surrounded here in Thermopylae, and all 300 died. But they killed more Persians than was killed among them. So for the first battle went to Persia. Persia got Athens. The second battle went to Persia. Persia now had a pass that joined two Athenian cities. But then in the navy, the Greeks had better sea equipment, better ships than the Persians. Again, if you look at the coastline of Greece, it's very, very, very rugged, which makes for a lot of harbors and a lot of easy to protect your shipping. The place was Salamis, near Athens. Now, folks, you get into one of the riddles here. By the way, I'll tell you right up front, the Greeks won the Battle of Salamis. But according to the story, a Greek scientist got a concave mirror, and he was able to shine the mirror on the Persian ships and set the ships on fire. There's one problem with that story. We have tried it today. Some of our scientists have tried the same experiment today and tried to set wooden vessels on fire with a concave mirror. And we've tried it with several mirrors, several different angles. We can't do it. How were they able to do it? Well, and if they were, I mean, now this is the story that's told. Now, most of you probably, when you were little, played with magnifying glasses, where you shine a magnifying glass, concentrate the sun's light on some leaf or some paper, and set the paper on fire or set the leaf on fire. Any of you ever did that when you were younger? Yeah, a couple of you at least. Well, yeah, I did it quite a bit. We have fun playing with these magnifying glasses. Concave mirrors do the same thing. Again, the story is that he set a bunch of Persian ships on fire. Thermopylae, I believe, was the scientist who did it. We cannot duplicate the feat. So the Battle of Salamis, according to the story, King Xerxes said, "Build me a throne on the edge of the waters, or on a hill on the edge of the water, so I can watch my people defeat the Greeks." They built him a wooden throne, and he sat on the throne and watched while his navy lost to the Greek navy. Then the Greeks engaged the Persians at Plataea. And there at Plataea, I did not write that down, but it will not be on the test. There at Plataea, the Greeks defeated the Persians, and for the second time in 2 generations, a Persian king went home in defeat. Well, Athens had been destroyed during the war, so Athens got together and formed the Delian League. That is, they said the Persians will come back. They've already been here twice. They'll come a third time. So we've got to be ready for them. So this time we'll be more ready than we were before. And Athens formed the Delian League. And with the money from the Delian League, they rebuilt her city. I hate to say it, but sometimes having your city destroyed is the best thing that can happen to it, because you'll rebuild it. The Great Chicago Fire of 120 years ago, when the people of Chicago rebuilt their city, they built it better than they had been before. When Sherman burned down the city of Atlanta, he said, "I know these people, that they will build a better city than the one I'm burning down." He was right. The people of Atlanta built a better city than the one he burned down. In the case of Athens, Athens rebuilt its city magnificently. They got some city-states to join in the Delian League, and of course these states had to pay money for the protection that Athens promised to give. The problem was the Persians never came back. And a bunch of the cities wanted to withdraw from the Delian League, and Athens said, "No, once in, you can't get out." And it's got some city-states become alarmed, so they formed a new league called the Peloponnesian League. The Peloponnesian League was headed by Sparta. So Greece became armed into 2 camps. One camp headed by Athens and one camp headed by Sparta. Again, Athens was mostly rebuilt from money that it got from other members of the league, and rarely in history has a city been able to beautify itself so much on other people's money. Into this scenario stepped one of the greatest leaders that Greece ever had, Pericles. The Greeks would elect an archon every year. Well, Pericles was elected 29 out of 30 years. There was one year when the political winds blew against him and he lost the election, but he won the next one after that. He made sure that the other members stayed in the Delian League, whether they wanted to or not. And he started building the Parthenon, the Acropolis, some of the places that Athens is still famous for. Now, the Parthenon has since been blown up in one of the wars when they used to store gunpowder during a certain war, and the gunpowder blew up. But the Parthenon still stands, so does the Acropolis. He built temples to Athena, at least one big temple to Athena, the goddess of Athens. Greatly beautifying Athens, and at one point he started to build the walls of Athens. When he built the walls, Sparta protested, hey, this will make you too powerful. We want to maintain a balance of power. Pericles said, well, you might be right. I'll tell you what, I'll go to your city and talk about it. So Pericles went to Sparta, but he whispered to his people, now while I'm gone, I want you to work on these walls day and night. And when you get them finished, come and tell me. So Pericles went to Sparta for 2 weeks, pretended to be negotiating with the Spartans about not building the walls. Then somebody came up to him and said, sir, the walls are finished. Pericles said to the Spartan government, goodbye, and went back home. And the Spartans found out, yes, the walls are there and finished. And he thought he'd pulled a really fast one on the Spartans. Wound up, though, the Spartans pulled a fast one on him. Well, inevitably, the conflict between Athens and Sparta was to lead to war. This war is known in history as the Peloponnesian War. Again, Peloponnesian is the name of two things about it. It's the name of the league that Sparta headed, and also the name of the war that Athens fought against Sparta, the Peloponnesian War. And again, when I was a youngster, this would remind me, the conflict between Athens and Sparta reminded me of the conflict between the United States and Soviet Union. And regrettably, I'll tell you up front, initially, Sparta won the Peloponnesian War, which symbolized to me that maybe in the future, Russia and the Soviet Union would win a future war against the United States. Be that as it may, the Peloponnesian War was to last 20 years. Now, Sparta had no seacoast, and the Peloponnesian League had no significant navy. So Athens relied on its navy. Sparta had its very well-trained and well-disciplined army. They relied on the army. They fought for 1 year, and the first year was indecisive. And then, at the end of the first year, they stopped fighting. In those days, warfare was a seasonal activity. They only fought in the summer, and then they rested in the winter time. So during the off-season, when they were not fighting, Pericles gave a funeral oration that's told in the first part of your chapter, where he told about how wonderful democracy was, how great a system of government democracy was, and lauded and keep this in mind, folks, because you might see it again. But he gave this speech lauding how wonderful democracy was, and not realizing that the Greek democracy was destined to fail. At least the Athenian part of it was destined to fail. All right, they got through the first year. Nobody knew who was going to win. They engaged in the second year. The Spartan army surrounded Athens. The Athenian people from the countryside went inside the walls of the city. Again, a dangerous thing to do in those days. So all the Athenians, city and countryside, were lodged inside the walls. And inside Athens, a plague broke out. Now, this was a problem. Plagues were a problem that those people had. And I can't say that we're rid of them, because just a couple years back there was a big plague that hit Africa, the Ebola plague, and they say now it's somewhat under control. But plagues are still a part of our history. Anyway, a plague hit Athens, and this plague carried off a third of the Athenian population, including Pericles himself. In those days they had no vaccines. The plagues would stay around until they eventually burned themselves out. What happened was everybody who was not immune died. Some people had natural immunity, it seems, and they never got it. Eventually, only the people who were immune would survive. Now, it's also was known, if you ever got the plague and recovered, you would not get it again. In other words, you had some kind of immunity. So again, some people seem to be born with immunity, some acquired immunity through having had the plague. But the plague was to carry off a third of Athens' population, including Pericles. Now I'm going to digress a little bit and tell you a story about Pericles' personal life. While the plague was devastating Athens, a lot of the Athenian wealthy lost their sons to the plague. And some of them found out that all they had left were illegitimate sons, and they had a law that only legitimate sons could inherit an estate. Well, they tried to bring it up before the Council of 500 to get the law changed to where illegitimate sons could inherit the estate if there were no legitimate sons. Pericles staunchly opposed it. No, nobody except legitimate sons must inherit an estate. Because at that time, Pericles had 2 legitimate sons and 1 illegitimate son. He didn't think that he'd ever run out of sons. Well, all of a sudden, like his first son died. He still had his younger son. His second son died. And Pope Pericles believed that a Greek should never show emotion, should be completely unemotional. It was said, though, when he watched the funeral of his second son, he all of a sudden lost complete control of emotions and broke down in a complete, utter fit of tears that he could not control. Then he went before the same council and asked if illegitimate sons could inherit an estate. The same thing that he had been opposed to all this time, all of a sudden now he was for it because he had 1 illegitimate son left. The council of 500 refused him. Said no, only legitimate sons can inherit an estate. Shortly after that, Pericles himself died, and I don't know what happened to his estate, but his estate did not go to his family, or at least his immediate offspring. Well, yes?
What do you mean by legitimate sons?
Legitimate sons are sons or children that are born from a marriage, a union of that's a lawful wedded union. And illegitimate sons or children are born from a non-wedded union. Now, when Pericles was a young man, he had a liaison with a woman to whom he was not married. That son was illegitimate. But when he grew up, of course, he matured, and he is, as far as you know, after that, he was always faithful to his wife once he was married. And he had 2 sons whom he was strongly believed to have been the father of. But the word illegitimate always means children who come who don't come from a marriage. Now, I recall many years ago, Ann Landers said there are no illegitimate children, there are only illegitimate parents. Be that as it may, the children oftentimes take the brunt. I mean, my mother would not want me telling this, but she's not around anymore, and neither is he. But my grandfather, on my mother's side, was illegitimate. My great-grandmother had 3 sons, and nobody knows to this day who the father was. We think we know, but we don't know for sure who the father was. Whoever he was not the man she married because she had not even met him when she married. Leaving that, I mean, but anyway, that's the story. Illegitimacy has been a part of human history all down through time. All right. Eventually, the Athenians stopped fighting when they realized they couldn't win and called a truce. The truce was greatly in Sparta's favor. Well, Athens broke the truce and invaded Sicily. And during one of my summer camps, I carried a book with me. I carried a book right here in a pocket that my uniform had right here on my blade. I carried this book, and it went into the detail about the War of Athens with Sicily. The War of Athens against Sicily was a complete disaster. Sicily whipped Athens soundly, and every one of the Athenian soldiers were either killed or sold into slavery. Athens continued to fight in spite of the loss. Eventually, the city of Athens was surrounded. Athens surrendered. When Athens surrendered, its walls were torn down. Sparta had been against the walls anyway. Its navy was disbanded. And Athens suffered terribly as a result of the big loss. The Delian League was broken up. Well, Athens said, we're not going to accept the rule of Sparta. Sparta was determined it was going to take over all of Greece and rule all of Greece. And it looked like they would have. Athens continued to resist in spite of having no navy and no walls. But into this scenario stepped another city, the city of Thebes. Now, here's a story, folks. I'll go into detail. The battle was the Battle of Leuctra. Essentially, for the Battle of Leuctra, for the first time in its history, a Spartan army was defeated by another Greek army in the open field. I mean, the way it happened, Sparta got together, its 2,000 troops, all it had. I mean, Sparta's population declined, but Sparta got with its other members of the Peloponnesian League and got together 10,000 soldiers, and they went against the army of 6,000 against Thebes. So you think you can guess the winner. Except that the cities that had joined with Sparta said, we didn't expect to fight. We thought we were just here to make a show of force. They wouldn't fight, so Sparta was forced to fight with its 2,000 men against Thebes is 6,000. The Theban general said, I know what I'll do. I'll line up my men 50 deep. And I'll have, some of his men, he lined up his best troops 50 deep and said, I want you to hit their flank. And in the meantime, he had his cavalry march smack dab into Sparta's center. And the cavalry was lined up about 50 deep itself. Basically, it broke the Spartan ranks in two. You know, where the Spartans, they hit him in the middle, and the middle was killed. Then the flank was outnumbered by 50 to 12. I mean, the Spartan flank was about 12 deep, and the Thebes. So basically, the Theban general hit them into where it hurt them, broke their line, and hit them on the right side, and started hacking away at them. Now, here's where the Spartan trained its men too well. The Spartan general saw, oops, my men are broken in the center, they're outflanked. He said, I know what I'll do. I'll call a retreat and reorganize my men and fight again. Hey, great idea. You can't follow it, so he ordered a retreat. Problem was, half his troops said, oh, we have never retreated before, we're not going to retreat now. So half his army refused to retreat. He had trained them too well. The half that retreated survived, the half that refused to retreat were annihilated. I mean, hey, folks, if the commanding general had said fall back, they should have fallen back, but they were annihilated, basically. And the Spartan army was, like I say, defeated for the first time in the open field. So it was neither Sparta nor Athens that was a hegemony. At this point, it was a Theban city, the city of Thebes, that appeared to be in the front of the lead of trying to unite the Greeks. In the meantime, Sparta went home, and when they got home, they found that their helots, or slaves, had got together with some other city-states, and they were ready to fight them. And the Spartans were badly bruised, mauled, tired, and wounded, and in no condition to fight. The Spartans then did the unthinkable. They actually negotiated a peace treaty with their own slaves, greatly in favor of the slaves. Time went on, the slaves began to number more and more. Also, a bunch of the slaves living in Messenia, who had fled Messenia, began to return. So the slaves outnumbered them first 3 to 1, 4 to 1, 5 to 1. And eventually the Spartans realized, hey, we just don't have the numbers to take over all of Athens. In the meantime, the Greeks went on to try to unite themselves. They couldn't. They fought other battles, since were indecisive. They got all their armies together on two sides, and the battle was a draw. They were finally united, though, when a foreigner named Philip of Macedon came down from Macedonia, and he united them. He conquered all the Greek city-states except Sparta. I've got to mention that. He didn't. The Spartans simply refused to join it. He didn't bother fooling them. He didn't care about Sparta anyway. But he conquered all the city-states, and Greece was finally united. But then the story from there, we'll take up from there when we start talking about the political history again in a few minutes. Philip of Macedon, you may know, is the father of Alexander the Great, who wound up conquering most of the whole world, at least the known world. So we'll get back to the political history of Greece in a few minutes. In the meantime, though, we'll go from there to Greek religion, Greek philosophies, Greek contributions to science and learning, all this in a minute or two. Religion. Okay. The Greeks believed that their gods lived on Mount Olympus. Now, folk, they were a little bit more sophisticated to think that their gods actually resided on what we could see. I mean, they had climbed Mount Olympus. Mount Olympus could be climbed. And Mount Olympus, I mean, they knew that at the top of the mountain was a bunch of fog and clouds. And Mount Olympus was continuously surrounded by clouds. But they believed that gods lived in another dimension, around, you might say around the corner, in a spiritual realm where they could not be seen by human eyes. But nevertheless, the gods resided on Mount Olympus, and they were called the Olympian deities. They practiced animal sacrifice, similar to the Jews. To honor, their chief god was Zeus. To honor Zeus, they would hold Olympic Games every 4 years. And during the time of the Olympics, the cities were expected to quit fighting each other. And we know the names of the winners of the Olympic Games, the Olympic trophies. The trophy was an olive leaf crown, which the winner would be crowned with. But during the time of the Olympics, they would stop their fighting, play their games, which consisted of foot races, jumping, lance throwing, and I don't know what other sports, possibly what we might call fencing today, sword fighting, but they would have a champion, and that champion would get a crown with an olive leaf. And because they had their alphabet that they borrowed from the Persians, we know who the winners were. One of the winners was Euripides, who died trying to tell his people that they'd beaten the Persians in the Battle of Marathon. Zeus is also known to the Romans as Jupiter, same god. Now, each city-state had its own god. For Sparta, their god was Ares, or the Romans called him Mars. Mars. Zeus's jealous wife was Hera. The Romans called her Juno. The month of June is named after her. The sun god was Apollo. I believe the Romans called him Hermes, but no, that was Mercury. Anyway, the sun god was Apollo, and Apollo drove his chariot across the sky every day, then would rest his chariot at night and drive it across the sky again every day. And one day he let his son, who had a mortal mother, his son was part mortal, drive the chariot, and the chariot got out of control because the sun could not handle it and almost burned the place up, but fortunately Apollo was able to grab it and the son died. One of the stories of their mythology. Folks, some people believe that this kind of myth actually happened. There really was a day when the sun got too hot for a while. It was once thought, even as recently as when I was the same age as you, the sun's output was always constant, never varied. Now we know that the output of all the stars varies, including our sun. And the sun's output determines our weather more than anything man does. And the sun's output may be on the verge of decreasing, owing to the fact that the sun is reaching a 400-year low in its sunspot cycles. The last time the sun did this, we had an ice age in the late 1600s, and it carried off a high percentage of Europe's population and the population of China, and even in about 2 million people in India. Could the same thing happen again? I mean, in the 1970s, and after we had our big, terrible winter in 1977, our scientists were saying ice age. Now our scientists are saying global warming. But we've had a scientist recently call for an ice age again. We'll wait and see. We'll have to wait and see. All right, anyway. Poseidon was a god of the sea. The Romans called him Neptune. Pluto, Pluto has made a lot of news this year. But Pluto was the god of the netherworld. Actually, the Greeks called him Hades. Place of the Hades. The Romans called him Pluto. Athena was the god of the Athenians, the goddess. Athena was the goddess of the Athenians. The Romans called her Minerva. And if you go to a theater, before a lot of movies, you'll see this magnificent statue of Athena holding a sword. This is the goddess of wisdom, goddess of philosophy. Athens was her chief city. Aphrodite, the Romans called her Venus. She was the goddess of fertility, of love, of sex. Corinth was her chief city. Mercury, the Romans called him Hermes, was a messenger, and if you don't even know the planets, the Greeks noticed that some of their stars were called wandering stars or planets. Of the planets, the fastest one is Mercury, or these planets would go from one constellation to another in the sky. Mercury was the fastest, and again, Mercury actually is the fastest planet because it's close to the sun, and it moves from one constellation to another faster than the others. So Mercury is the messenger of the gods. Very fleet-footed. He's pictured with wings on his feet. Yes?
Wasn't he like hybrid?
Hybrid?
Yeah, like he was the.
Several of them were. He might have been.
Zeus.
Actually, I think he was. He was born on Earth. On the day he was born, he was able to get some cows to march backwards, and he fooled his brother Apollo. Zeus was his father, and he fooled his brother Apollo. So Apollo finally found out who had done the mischief when he talked to an old man. He said, "I saw this baby leading some cows, walking them backwards." Yeah, I mean, this is part of their mythology, but Zeus said to his older brother, to his son, his oldest son Apollo, "Hey, can you forgive the boy? He's just a newborn and he doesn't know any better." And then they became fast friends, and Apollo gave his younger brother a gift of a lyre because Apollo loved music. Have you ever read any of these mythologies by any chance? Yeah, a few of you. Okay, yes. This was part of their religion. Again, Saturn is known as Cronus. Saturn was the slowest of the gods, and they pictured Saturn being an old man. Supposedly, in their mythology, the first of the gods had been Uranus, and Uranus had been very evil, so Uranus had been overthrown by his son Saturn, and Uranus said to Saturn, "Your sons will overthrow you." So Saturn then swallowed his 3 sons alive. His 3 sons were Zeus, Poseidon, and Pluto, or Hermes, Pluto. Anyway, Hades. Yeah, 3 sons alive, but eventually these sons were able to come outside their father, and Zeus the 3 boys overtook their father, and Saturn was an old man, and the gods so slower than the others. Now, oh yes, these Greeks also believed that there had been on Earth a race of giants called Titans. And these Titans were giant. Now, folk, again, every ancient civilization you know of has stories about ancient peoples who were once very, very large in stature. Some of them as high as 25 and 30 feet, or some of them as tall as 200 or 300 feet tall. Race of giants that they called Titans. And Zeus had eventually overcome the Titans and put them into a very foul place called Tartarus. The Greek place for the dead was Hades. And there in Hades, mostly they became nothing more than mind-numbed zombies and have been passed off an aimless existence. And this belief was eventually helped the spread of Christianity, because pagan beliefs, and this religion, by the way, is known as paganism. Pagan beliefs did not give much of a happy afterlife for most of the Greek and Roman people. Now, there were some oracles, places where the gods met them. The 2 oracles that were in service at the time was one at Delphi, and there was another one at Egypt. Alexander the Great was able to go to both of them. Now, folk, again, if somebody wanted to hear from Apollo, he would go to this oracle at Delphi, and he would ask the oracle, ask a priestess for advice on what he should do. The priestess would go to another room, and supposedly a cloud would envelop her, and she would receive a message from Apollo, which she would give to the person who was asking, and the person would go away believing he received the divine message from Apollo. Now, I'll give you an example of some of these messages. The oracle at Delphi told Philip of Macedon, if you go against the Persians, no, wait, that's another story. He told Philip of Macedon, the bull has been killed, the sacrifice is ready. Well, Philip said, oh, that means the sacrifice is the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire has been slain, all I got to do is go get it. Instead, he himself was killed. Now, in another case, a king named Croesus asked, should he go to war against the Persian Empire? And the oracle said, if you go to war against the Persian Empire, you will destroy a great empire. The empire he destroyed was his own empire. These oracles sometimes appeared to be deceptive, but the messages they gave were vague, indecisive. In other words, basically, it's going to rain today unless it doesn't. I mean, this was typical. Now, so before you think it's all fate, I've got to tell you something. At some point, these oracles quit talking to the people, and their use died. Today, they're nothing but, we know where they were. They're just a bunch of pile of rubble, just ruins. The Oracle at Delphi is just a ruin. The Oracle in Egypt, again, just nothing more than a ruin. And it becomes an issue now, why did the gods quit communicating with them? Or, again, if it had all been fakery, folks, they could have continued the fakery. You can decide for yourself whatever you want to believe. I mean, this may be more for a theology class, a history class. But for some reason, these gods quit communicating with them. And it appeared to the Greeks after a time, the Greeks felt that their gods were dead, that their gods were no longer interacting with them. And it opened up the way for the founding of a new religion. Eventually, like I say, the Greeks became skeptical of these gods, and they began after a while to turn and embrace new gods. They embraced the mystery religions, which you will talk about before we end the chapter, and they eventually turned to Christianity later in the story. Now, the writing of history, the Greeks are credited with being the first historians. The man who is said to be the father of history is Herodotus. And he was followed by Thucydides. Now, folk, Herodotus was far from being the first person to write history. The Jews had written history before Herodotus, but one reason that our modern historians want to give Herodotus credit is because Herodotus left out a lot of the magic, the religion, superstition in history that had been included in earlier histories. In other words, Homer, we don't consider him history because he has too much about the gods, too much magic in it, too much supernatural. And the same thing can be said, and I'm saying this with all due respect, the same thing can be said for the Bible, for the Vedas. We don't consider, for the writings of the Sumerians, I mean, modern day historians simply cannot accept the idea that the Sumerian gods were living in a physical presence in the Sumerian temples. By the way, the Egyptians believed the same thing, that their gods had a physical, or at one time, way back there, it had a physical presence in their temples. And modern historians cannot accept this, so Herodotus left out a lot of this and wrote a history that was not completely free of all supernatural. Thucydides came along later, and his history was even more free of the supernatural and more materialistic, and that's why modern day historians consider these men to be the fathers of history, particularly Herodotus. Herodotus, by the way, wrote a history of the whole world from the beginnings, and most of what we know about the Persian Empire comes from him, because the Persian writings have been destroyed along the way, or they wrote on the paper or papyrus that hasn't come down to us. But Herodotus' writings were copied and recopied and recopied until his writings have survived to this day for us. So he's called the father of history. Now, he wrote about the Peloponnesian War. In fact, what gave him time to write, I mean, book I'd like to write myself, but I mean, a lot of times we don't find the time. Herodotus was a general in the Athenian army. His army lost. He was exiled. And once in exile, he had all kinds of time on his hands, know what to do. So he got together a bunch of paper and pen and wrote history. And he wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War. And he wrote a history of Persia. And even his history includes a lot of the history of the Jews. Now, I will say this. There have been persons who say that during the captivity, a bunch of Jews escaped to Greece. This is known to be true. And some historians believe that there's a lot of Judaic elements in Greek mythology, particularly the part about the animal sacrifice, the sheep and goat sacrifices. The Greek sacrifices had a lot in common with the Jewish sacrifices. And one historian said that he was a Jewish historian, the only part of Socrates that made any sense, or the only part of Plato that made any sense, was what Plato and Socrates borrowed from Jews. Be that as it may. Thucydides, again, far less religious than Herodotus. Thucydides wrote a story about Socrates, and a lot of what we know about Socrates comes from Thucydides. The Greeks are the first people we know of to put on plays get on the stage and put on drama. One of the most famous plays was a story of Oedipus the king. The man who wrote it was Sophocles. When Oedipus was born, a soothsayer said to his mother, "Now this boy of yours is going to marry you and kill your husband, or kill his father and marry you." The father heard about it and banished Oedipus. But again, what the gods had said was fate, and the Chinese said the same thing, that nothing could alter it. Eventually, Oedipus, not realizing the king was his father, murdered the king, married the king's wife, and not realizing it was her mother. And from that day to this, persons who have their own kind of love for their mother are said to have suffering from an Oedipus complex. Sigmund Freud himself gave that term Oedipus complex to that, and it said that Sigmund Freud himself had an Oedipus complex. I don't want to elaborate on it anymore, but basically, Oedipus then fulfilled what had been foretold. The story of Oedipus also is called a tragedy. Tragedy is a story where the hero dies. Most of the time because the gods have willed it. Again, I just have to ask this, folk. Have any of you run into the story of Oedipus in your literature classes or your world? Okay, a couple of you, all right. If not, if you see it, if you take world literature, you'll probably run into it, and at least you've been exposed to it. Now, art. The Greeks were not like modern day artists in that their art strove for realism. They claimed that they could make a statue in an apple that was so realistic that a deer would come up and try to eat it. I mean, even a stone statue, they not only made the statue of stone, but then they would paint it so well that you could not that you would mistake the real for the fake. Now, today's art says leave realism to the camera. Cameras take real pictures, and today's artists don't strive for realism. Their temples are an example of their art. They're famous for their columns that supported the roof of the temple. And if you ever would see a Greek temple, they had no sides. They had columns that supported the roof, so you had a roof and you had the columns. But the temperature inside the temple was going to be the same as the temperature outside, because there was a shade against the sun and protection from the rain, but no protection from this cold wind. Now, in their statues, the gods. All right, when I was 11 years old, one of my classmates asked me, why do these Greek statues, the gods always show them naked? I did not know the answer to that, but basically, they were trying to show that their gods had the ideal body. The Greek gods, now this ideal body was to be copied later, or try to be, by a man named Adolf Hitler, who believed that he could create a race of supermen where everybody would have a big, bulging biceps and a broad shoulders and a big, bulging, muscular chest. The Superman comic, if any of you have seen the Superman comic, supposedly he had the ideal body. Now, I had a young girl ask me, who's to say what the ideal body is? I have to say it's the same thing. Nobody knows. But when I was a kid, there was a man named Charles Atlas who got his ads in every comic. And he would say that I can build for you the ideal body if you just simply send me $5 and I'll show you how you can do the right exercises and get the ideal body. It's now known that unless you have the right genetic combination, you will not get the body that they picture Charles Atlas got, for the body that Superman has. You have to have the right genetic combination. You can help your muscles a little bit, but unless you were born with the right genes, you're not going to build up that kind of strength. There was a Georgia man named Paul Anderson who lifted 6,000 pounds one time. He could lift the front end of a car while somebody else changed a tire. Just lifted up with his bare hands, motor and all. And I've had people say you don't believe it. Yeah, Paul Anderson was his name. He was a 1956 Olympic champion. But eventually Paul Anderson's record was broken by a Russian. But again, folks, unless you have that kind of, unless you have the right genetic combination, you're not going to be able to build yourself up to do that. All right. But the Greek gods, supposedly, they had the ideal male body. All right, now turning from there to philosophy. The Greeks were famous, really famous, particularly the Athenians, for their philosophy. philosophy, well, by definition, it's an attempt to understand our universe and our place in it. Now, there's several of it, but particularly without recourse to religion. In other words, there's two ways to try to explain it. One is to explain the universe by religion. Another way is by philosophy without religion. Again, you might have heard other definitions given, and some of you might have taken a philosophy class. Anyway, the first group of people your book talks about is the sophist. Sophia, the word Sophia means, like it comes from the word philosophy. Sophia means a love of, or wisdom, love of wisdom. But the sophist said, we cannot understand the universe. Humans don't have the ability to understand the universe. So while we're here, our only purpose is to improve yourself. So only the study of humans and the study of humanity is the only study worth our endeavor. The study of trying to understand how the universe is put together, that's beyond human. Again, folks, let me hasten to state, all of these philosophies have a grain of truth and a grain of error in them. And I don't exactly subscribe to any of them 100%. The sophists stressed rhetoric and debate. Debate and rhetoric. Now, debates are making big news right now. Now, I want to give you an example of the difference between rhetoric and real speech. All right, during the American Revolution, you had two men, both from Virginia, and they both men liked each other, but they were different. The men I'm talking about were Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. All right, when Patrick Henry gave a speech, he said, our chains are forged on the plains of Boston. You can hear their clanking. Is life so dear and peace so sweet to be purchased with chains and slavery? I know not what course others may take as for me, give me liberty or give me death. That's Patrick Henry. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and he said, he, the king, he has abolished our legislators and imposed governors on us without our consent. He has taken our people to trial all the way across the seas without our consent. He has quartered troops in our private homes without the consent of the owner. Basically said, this is specifically what the king has done to us. Patrick Henry, you can be called him a rhetorician. He was rhetoric. Comparing the colonials to slaves, pure rhetoric. And in the course of the debates, you're going to run into rhetoric. What is rhetoric and what is substance? Thomas Jefferson actually got specific, and here is what the King of England has done to us. There is a difference. Both men, again, Virginians, both lived at the same time, both describing the same issue. The two men knew each other and even liked each other. But the one was into rhetoric, no substance. The other one was strongly into substance, without rhetoric. Thomas Jefferson hated debate. Now, this brings us up to perhaps the most famous philosopher of all time, Socrates. Socrates is famous for the quote, know thyself, even though if you look him up, you might find that others had said it, that he was actually quoting some other philosophers who had said it before him. The thing about this thought, know thyself, it could be one of the greatest sayings, the greatest two words of all time, that is ever uttered, or you might realize it's an impossibility. Who can really know himself? Know thyself. Now, he believed that real knowledge, now, folks, I'm going to digress here. So some of this sounds far out and crazy. Let it sound far out and crazy. Don't try to understand it because, again, these people live in a different world than we do. But he believed that real knowledge lay inside us. And all the knowledge of the universe lay inside, and all it would take was a bunch of questioning to bring it out. So his method of teaching was called the question and answer method. Just simply, if you keep asking a person a question enough, keep asking, they'll eventually come up with the right answer. Now, I want to ask you some folk. How many of you know how tightly the nuts on the cylinder of your car, the cylinder head, should be tight. How tight should it torqued? If you don't know, don't feel bad. I don't know either. All the questioning I can do will not help. But somebody has to know that, folks. It is important. If you don't get all those cylinder head nuts tightened to the same torque, one of them is going to take more beating than the other one, and eventually it's going to work the cylinder head right off. They have to all be tightened evenly. Maybe you didn't know that. But if you don't know how tight you have to see that, when I was at Lockheed, somebody had to know how tight each of these nuts on the airplane should be torqued. Torque one of them too tight, and it was going to take more of a beating than the other nuts around it, or the other bolts around it, whatever. Again, if you don't know, all the questioning I can ask will not get that knowledge out of you. My wife's a newspaper reporter, and much too often she'll ask a question. When I give her the best answer I can, it's not good enough. She'll keep asking the same question again and try to get another answer. And then, well, no, that's not good. Hey, listen, all the questioning you do is not, I don't have an answer. I can't give you an answer. Just don't ask anymore. I've given you the best answer I can. Please, I don't have a better answer. I won't know until tomorrow. I won't know that until such and such happens. Until then, I can't give you an answer. But she recently told me that reporters are told to keep asking until you get the answer that can make for the best quote in the paper. Well, don't act like a reporter around us. We don't. All right. But he believed that the real knowledge resides inside you, and the right kind of examination could bring it forth. So he questioned and answered. Now, he questioned everything the Athenians believed, and folks, this is what wound up being his undoing. He even questioned their religion. It has been said that he made fun of their gods, the worship of their gods. But again, there's all kinds of mythologies that have sprung up about him. And there have been books written to try to clear up, now what did he actually say and what did he not? But one thing he actually said, now this was a professor who was an expert at Socrates. He said, everywhere I go, when people find out I'm the country's #1 expert in Socrates, they'll ask me this, did Socrates really say, and here's a quote, give a society too much freedom and after a while they start demanding order? He said yes. So he put on his webpage, here's what he actually said. He said the people in Athens are so independent now that even the animals do not obey their masters. The dog doesn't come when their masters call him. The donkey doesn't move when his master tells him to. The wives do not obey their husbands. The children do not obey their parents. That everybody is completely free. And he said this type of society is eventually going to lead to where the people are going to start demanding some kind of order, and they will demand a dictatorship to take over and bring some kind of order and bring some kind of control, because we cannot live in a society where that everybody is just too independent. Too much freedom. This he actually is credited with having said. Too much freedom leads the people to demand. Now Socrates had no use for democracy, neither did Plato, is the person who came after him. He believed that everybody thought he was good, nobody was intentionally evil. And folk, I have a difficult time with that. I think some people know they're bad and just want to be bad and are intentionally bad. But he said, ignorance is the cause of all evil actions. Educate people, and after a while we'll all come to believe alike when we all get the knowledge of the truth. That's one thing he said. I can't agree with him less. I can't disagree with him more. He believed that education, right thinking, would solve the problem of evil. It's known he went to Egypt one time and might have received some of his ideas from Egyptian initiates. Now, be that as it may. Now, the folk, if you start researching Socrates, and I started searching for him for about 17 years. I started going to the internet, and from time to time I'll look at Socrates again. Only 1 out of 4 web pages will tell you what I'm about to say. A lot of web pages commend him that he was a free thinker. In other words, they define a free thinker as a person who questions religion. The fact of the matter is, there hardly ever was a more spiritually minded man than Socrates, so I hardly can call him a free thinker. But here is what I really think made Socrates tick, and this is something that the people who believe he was a free thinker cannot handle, and most of the time they just simply leave it off. Socrates claimed to be buddies with a demon. The Greeks spelled it this way. He said that this demon would whisper things to his ear, and he claimed this demon is the source of all my ideas. He said at one time he visited this demon in his abode, and this demon lived in a super magnificent palace, furnished and was awaited on by several demon servants. But this demon was always at his side, whispering things into his ear. Which brings me up to another point that I will mention later, and folk, I'm going to tell you right up front before I get to this. If you think I'm a little bit scared, I really am talking about this topic I'm about to talk about because of what's going on today, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. And let the consequence be what they may. The Greek men were homosexual. Their ideal about sex was, of course, they married because they had to pass on their estate to the children. They had to have children, of course, to keep the society going. So they would marry a member of the opposite sex. But most Greek men, particularly the aristocrats, had young boys whom they liked. And it was sex between men and young boys, which is still illegal in this country. And these men fought this temptation. Well, Socrates admitted that he had a lot of temptation from young boys, but he said that this demon kept him from yielding to the temptation of young boys. As far as we know, he overcame it. Now, Socrates married. Again, this was part of his attempt to fight his urges. Socrates married and had 3 sons. We know their names. Xenophon, I believe, gave us her names. We know his wife's name. Some accounts say that his wife was very independent, roamed the streets at will, and he hardly ever saw her. He'd get up in the morning and she'd go one way, he'd go another. But the original sources do not say this about her. Basically, his wife was a shrew, an untamed, uncontrollable woman. But the original sources do not say this about her. The first source to say this about her was written hundreds of years after Socrates and his wife would have died. But anyway, back to this. Socrates fought his homosexual urges. The next one after him, Plato did not even attempt to fight him, and Aristotle didn't even argue with him anymore. All 3 of these men, Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle, and Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. All 4 of these men, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Alexander, were known to have had homosexual tendencies. Socrates might have overcome it, but he credited his demon buddy with overcoming it. Now, today's psychologists will say that this shows that Socrates suffered from a type of epilepsy, and they have a name for it. I mean, we have all these fancy names. They believe that the right kind of drugs could have cured him of his epilepsy. Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, a lot of these ancient men are said to have had epilepsy, owing to the fact that they claim to have had some kind of contact with the spirit world. In modern day psychiatry or psychology, this shows that we have a type of epilepsy. All right, I'll pause here. Does anybody have any comments? Yes?
Wait. Is it saying that the homosexual tendencies?
Yeah, Socrates admitted to having the tendencies, which he claims to have overcome.
Yeah, but is it linking that to the epilepsy?
No, not the homosexual tendencies, the demon. The contact with the demon is what they call epileptic. Yeah, it's not the, okay, if I didn't make that clear. It was his claim to have had contact with the spirit world. Supposedly shows that he had a type of epilepsy. That he was, he claimed that he was buddies with a demon, and he had visited this demon, and this demon was constantly by his side, whispering things into his ear and keeping him from moral failure. I mean, what I'm telling you in plain language, my teachers never told me. I just dug it up on my own. I mean, even when I was in graduate school, Dr. Bing would talk about Socrates kept himself morally upright, but did not tell us any detail about what his moral issues were. Now, eventually, the people of Athens stood him as long as good. I mean, every time someone go to court, Socrates meet him and can try to convince him, you don't have a case. Your case is the worst case. And folks, you can make any case at all appear to be bad, or you can make even a lousy of cases appear to be good. I mean, there are people who are saying we didn't go to the moon. There are people who are saying an airplane never hit the Pentagon. I mean, some of you may have heard these stories. You can make a case for any phenomena in the universe and make something that really did happen appear that it didn't happen, or whatever. the people of Athens finally got tired of Socrates, and they brought him before the Council of 500 on a charge of corrupting the youth. Now, being a father of 3 children myself, I'm very much aware of how much we all parents are concerned that we want to make sure our young people adopt our values, our religious values, our political values. And his friendship with the demon had a lot to do with it, by the way. They were saying he is leading us away from the worship of our own gods. Also, he was accused of being in cahoots with Sparta. And folk, he might have been, because Sparta had some kind of law and order, which Socrates found. Something else. A lot of college professors during the Cold War were pro-communist. I had one at UT, and a lot of them still are. And even as just before the fall of the communist world in 1989 and 1990, just before the collapse of communism in Russia, a lot of college professors were writing books to talk about how great and how wonderful things were in the Soviet Union. This is a failing. A lot of times intellectuals have this thing. And, well, Father Ritter was the Russian involved in the 1930s. But he started talking about how wonderful Mussolini and Hitler were, and all of a sudden he found we're at war with Hitler and Mussolini. And Father Ritter was thrown out in the cold, you might say, and left there, and never was able to come back from having taken sides with Hitler and Mussolini. But a lot of times, high up people intellectually will say, our enemy is better than we are. It's like the old saying, the grass looks greener on the other side. We go over to the other side, folk, and find out the grass was really greener back there where I left it. If you haven't done it yet, you probably will at some point in your life. Anyway, Socrates was suspected of being in cahoots with the Spartans. He was brought before the Council of 500. The Council of 500 condemned him. They actually had 2 trials. One was to decide whether he was guilty of corrupting youth or not. Now, the figures I'm kind of making up. I mean, I've seen the figures, but the figures were something like 260, 240 to find him guilty. Then they had another trial to determine a death penalty, where he barely was found guilty of the charge of corrupting youth. But when it came to time to discuss the penalty, he smart-mouthed the council. What right do you have to judge me? And besides that, look at Plato. Is Plato corrupted? And I've been Plato's leading teacher all these years. Have I corrupted Plato? The council then found him like guilty for the death penalty, 400 to 100, or something like that. Really, really high majority, because I mean, he probably could have escaped the death penalty if he had shown more respect and more courtesy toward it, because the first vote was close. The second vote was overwhelming. So at the appointed day, I mean, well, the story is told that some of his friends felt he was treated unjustly, and they tried to rescue him. He said, no, I won't take part in it. That would be wrong. On the day of his death, he cheerfully drank hemlock and died. And no sooner had he died than the Athenians said one to each other, hey, we have killed a saint, we have killed a great man, and they elevated him to the status almost of a sage, almost the status of a god. This is a way that a lot of times humans will treat people whom they don't like, they can't stand while he's alive, and once he's gone, hey man, we shouldn't have done that. All right, Socrates had many a pupil, but the most famous one is Plato. Again, if you look in more detail, Plato, we know, went to Egypt. Basically, here's what he came back saying. I mean, after he spent some time with Socrates, he said the universe consists of a higher level and a lower level. So the level we live on is the level of the senses. But the higher level of the universe is the ideal level. In the ideal level, clothes never wear out, houses never grow old, animals never grow old, people never grow old. In the ideal world. But in the world of the senses that we live in, it's the lower world. It's the evil world, the bad world. What we live in is bad. Now, folks, this had 2 bad effects. Number one, when Christianity came along later and preaching resurrection, some of the Greeks said, who would want to rise back to this evil world? This world is evil, so why resurrect? And also, it hindered scientific progress, because you cannot have scientific progress until you start believing that there's a lot of regularity and order in the universe. So much so that you can put together another device like this one, and you may not realize how much high tech involved in what we consider a cheapo device. Millions of little transistors working together. You can put together another device like this one, and the other device will do the same thing this one does. If you don't believe there's regularity and order in the universe, you cannot have high technology. So without realizing it, Plato had set the mankind back hundreds of years by convincing us that the world of our senses is really inferior and evil and irregular. So he was focused on the ideals or ideal forms. He said that through training we can get to the ideal world, and this is the goal of philosophy. And also he made it easy for him to blame his moral failures on his body. He said, now, hey, don't worry about what your outer self does, as long as your inner self is clean. Now, my outer man might do just any old thing, but as long as I'm clean on the inside, now, folks don't actually follow this. This was Plato, yeah, but as long as I'm clean inside, I'm clean. Never mind what my outer self does. Never mind because my body is controlled by its passions, its lust, its greed, its evil desires, and that's something that I can't help. But I keep myself clean on the inside, and never mind if you're really clean on the inside, it'll show up on the outside. That's my thinking, but not his. So he's famous for a very famous quote. I've quoted this past before, particularly, and I quote this when I was teaching 5th graders penmanship. Do as I say, but don't do as I do. Very famous quote. In other words, do as I say. As I say, that's the upward story, higher ideal world. But as I do, don't do that. As I do, that's lower story, lower level. Plato also gave us a story of the lost continent of Atlantis. Now, folks, that clock is about 3 minutes past, so I see some of you getting a little bit restless. Say, you'll get out in time, but that clock is a little bit fast. But anyway, Plato. Many years ago, my wife called me at work when I was at Lockheed and said, can you please come home? These 3 children just simply will not let me get ready. I'm very sick. I said, okay. I told my boss I need to come home. Came home, and I got to thinking, now what can I do to get them out of her hair? I said, I don't know, I'll take them to see the movie Atlantis. So I got them home, and I said, I'm going to take them out. Oh, you don't have to. I said, yes. If you're as sick as you claim you are, this will give you at least 4 hours rest. I'll take them to a restaurant, take them to see the movie Atlantis, and it'll be 4 or 5 hours getting home, and you'll get a chance to rest. Anyway, the story of Atlantis. So my children at least were exposed to it. The youngest one probably don't remember it, but anyway, the story of Atlantis is at one time there was a magnificent city that was about to conquer the world. And according to the Egyptians who told to Plato, she said, you Greeks were what stopped them. You actually got together your army and defeated the race of Titans that were about to overcome the world. And the city of Atlantis was located just beyond the Pillars of Hercules. In other words, what is today the Atlantic Ocean? The word Atlantic comes from Atlantis. So does the word Atlanta also, the city of Atlanta. So after you Greeks defeated the Titans from Atlanta, the city of Atlantis fell into the sea and has not been seen since. Well, so many a person looked for Atlantis. And we thought a few years ago we found it in Spain, that we got some sonar and could find regular shaped buildings, but that was overcome by a big tidal wave. Be that as it may, a lot of people don't accept this story. The fact is, Atlantis has been searched for all over the world. There have been folk, underwater cities found. Alexandria, Egypt, as part of it's underwater. How did it sink down, or did the ocean just rise up and swallow it? We don't know, because the historical records are not there, but we have found buildings underwater, pyramid shapes underwater, even off the coast of Japan, off the several places around the world. We have found the main cities that might have been the basis for the story of Atlantis. Okay, at this point,